Web-based user authentication. Let's begin. I'd like you to imagine that you and I have been given the requirement to authenticate every user who gets access onto our networks. They could be guests, they could be members of Active Directory, but we need to know who they are before they get in. So in a situation like that, we could have a problem if somebody brings their own computer to work. For example, this computer is not a member of the domain. Let's say it's hanging off of port gig 0/8 on the switch. And let's say the user behind that computer is IT Bob. Now, if there's no supplicant enabled on that, and there's no entry as an endpoint for the MAC address of this PC, so it can be used with MAC authentication bypass, we do have another option, and that is web-based authentication of the user Bob. To make this work, we have a few things we're going to configure on the switch and a few things we're going to configure on ICE. Specifically on the switch, we're going to enable the switch for change of authorization messages from the ICE server over to the switch. So if there's some configuration change or some modification that the ICE server needs to tell the switch about, it can initiate that conversation. On the switch, we also may want to have some basic access control lists that are set up to control and set up limited access for an individual who has not yet authenticated. So maybe we're allowing some DNS or some DHCP in through this port. We're also going to create on the switch a redirect ACL. It's an access list that says, okay, we want to take all traffic that is going to port 80 or port 443. And we want to be able to redirect that over to the ICE server. So in the event we have a port where we don't yet know who the user is, we can take any traffic that this user is trying to send to port 80 or 443. We can redirect it, the switch can redirect it over to ICE to a web-based portal, which is asking that user to put in their credentials, their username and password, so we can identify who that user is. On the ICE server itself, to support web-based authentication, we can create additional authorization profiles. One that's specifying that we do want to do the redirection for unknown users and redirect it over to the ICE server. And then once that user has authenticated, let's have another authorization profile for access based on that user's authentication. And each of these authorization profiles could have their own downloadable ACL associated with them. And the other trick, and it really is kind of a trick that we're going to do on the ICE server, is that we're going to say for our MAB rules for authentication, if we have an unknown user, meaning the MAC address is not an endpoint identified in ICE, we don't know who that user is or that account is, we could tell MAB to go ahead and continue instead of sending a reject message back to the switch. And that continue access could allow this user to try to send web traffic into the network, which could be redirected over to the ICE server, so we could authenticate that user. And then after we know who the user is, allow that user full access to the network without the redirection. So in this video, I'm going to walk you through the configuration on both the switch and on the ICE server to make it work. And we'll test it to verify that the web authentication and redirection does work. Let's start off with our switch configuration. I've included all of the relevant AAA and Radius and 802.1x configurations that I'm currently using on switch number 1 in this document right here. And I put this document in the Nugget Lab files. And the file is called webauth switch1 configuration.rtf. And most of these commands you and I have already put onto this switch. I just want to make sure we had all the commands in one place, and then I can focus on what I added in addition to what we had previously for the benefit of web authentication. And let's start with this little gem right here. This allows COA, the change of authorization, to be sent from the ICE server over to the switch. So if ICE wants to make a decision to de-authenticate a port or bounce a port or change the status for authorization on a port, this will allow our ICE server, which is at 192.168.1.117, to reach out to the switch to make those changes. It basically says to the switch, hey, please be willing to accept commands as they come in from this radius server at this IP address of .117. And the key of nugget exclamation mark 23 is the same key that we used previously when we defined that AAA server. So we have this new piece that's added to our configuration. And if we scroll down a little bit more, here we have the configuration for port 7, which we've used previously. We used that for the 802.1x authentication as well as MAC authentication bypass. And what you and I get to do for web authentication is we'll have another device on port 8. And on port 8, we'll use virtually the identical configuration, except we'll go ahead and put the port 8 into VLAN 10 to begin with. So regarding the port, there's really not anything brand new or exciting that we're doing for this port that we're going to be using with web authentication that we haven't done with the previous port. This access control list here, sample-ACL, can represent the controls we want to have in place on a port before the authentication happens. So sample-ACL may permit, for example, basic DHCP services, maybe some Active Directory traffic back and forth, maybe some DNS. It depends on your environment and how secure you want a port to be. And the cool thing is, even if we have this authentication open, that ACL that we have applied inbound on this port will do our enforcement until that port becomes authorized and some additional policy overrides this default ACL that we've put in place. So if we scroll down, the other thing I've added for this video is I added these two commands to enable web services on this switch. And those are required to allow the redirection. So now our user, who's going to be connected on port gig 0/8 on the switch, when link comes up, the switch port is going to try MAC authentication bypass. It's going to try .1x. And by default, if this computer doesn't have a supplicant running, 802.1x is going to fail. And if ICE doesn't have the MAC address of this computer set up as an identity for an endpoint, the MAC authentication bypass is also going to fail. So you might say, well, Keith, when does the web authentication kick in? Well, what we can do on ICE is we can say that during MAC authentication bypass, if the user is unknown, which basically equates to the fact that we don't have that MAC address stored in ICE as an endpoint, we can say continue. And as the process continues, we can set up additional rules that indicate when the switch receives traffic from this host right here. If it's port 80 or port 443, we can actually have the switch redirect that traffic over to the ICE server for the benefit of centralized web authentication. Now this access control list I just happened to name redirect. We could have named it Bubba. Because over here on the ICE server, we're going to create a profile. And that profile is going to say that if this user is unknown, we want to go ahead and invoke this access control list, which currently exists on the switch, and tell the switch to go ahead and start redirecting any web or HTTPS traffic that the user is trying to send into that port and redirect it over here to a specific URL at the ICE server. Now that specific URL is also going to contain the session ID information. So the end result is this. The MAC authentication bypass doesn't have the MAC address in ICE, but instead of failing, it continues to allow this user to have their web traffic redirected over to ICE, where we can then present a interface for that user to provide their credentials to authenticate. And then once the ICE server knows who that user is, we can then push another policy down to that port, which gives that user full access. And if we scroll down a little bit more, here's the rest of our switch config. And again, most of this you and I did previously in earlier videos in this course. And again, that's saved for you as part of the Nugget Lab files that you can download and reference for your own practice. Because we're using centralized web authentication, we can customize the web page in the portal that our users are going to be connected to provide their authentication information. And to get there, we're going to go to Administration, and over here under Web Portal Management, we can select Settings. We also could have gotten there by selecting Administration here, clicking on Web Portal Management, clicking on Settings, and that also would have brought you and I to this same place. Now, regarding the portal, there's a ton of things that we can customize about it. For example, if we go to General and we go to Portal Theme, we can change the colors and the logos. We can just really go to town. But I think what you and I got to do before we start changing colors and logos is we got to focus on getting basic connectivity and getting the functionality working. And then once it's working, we can go back and change the colors and the logos and so forth for the customized portal. If we open up the guest section and there's a multi-portal configuration, if we expand that, there is a default guest portal. So we could go ahead and choose to use that if we wanted to, or we could go ahead and create our own. So if we wanted to create our own new portal configuration, we click on Add. We'll call it our captive portal, and I'm referring to it as a captive portal because the user really can't get too much past this point until they authenticate. So we're holding them captive until they put their credentials in at the portal and authenticate, which if we boil it all down is basically authenticating via the web, using a web interface for the authentication. So we can use the default portal. If we go to Operations, let's go ahead and require them to agree to an acceptable use policy the first time they log in. If we go over here to Authentication, let's specify that we want to use the Active Directory, then local database on the iServer. That's our identity source sequence that we created earlier. We'll go ahead and use it again, and then we'll click on Submit. And now we have this our captive portal that we can refer to and use for web authentication. Even though there is a default access control list at the switch that we applied inbound on port gig 0/8, we could also push down an access control list to control what access is available on a port for an individual waiting on web-based authentication. And if we wanted to use a custom access control list in association with an authorization profile, we'd want to create that downloadable access control list first. And to do that, we're going to go to Policy, and from the Policy menu under Policy Elements, we're going to click on Results. And another way we can get to the same place is click on Policy and Policy Elements, Results, and that's yet another way of navigating to the same place. If we expand authorization, here we have our downloadable ACLs. We have a couple of them by default. We have the deny all traffic and permit all traffic. And if we wanted a new downloadable ACL that we could place on a port while we're waiting for that user to authenticate, we could create a new downloadable ACL by clicking on Add. And let's name this Waiting for WebAuth. And then inside of this downloadable ACL, we could specify exactly what controls we want on that port until the user has fully authenticated, at which point we could download a different access control list based on a different authorization profile. So for example here, if I do a cut and paste and put in the access control list I want to use, it's possible that the syntax that we might use on a Cisco router may not be the exact syntax that's supported here for a downloadable ACL. Should be very, very similar, and there's a very easy way to check by clicking on this link that says Check Dynamic ACL Syntax. So we'll click that, and it says, Keith, you've got some issues. And we can scroll down through those issues. Let's take a look at the first one. And it says, sure enough, line 2's got a problem. Permit UDP any equals DNS. So it doesn't understand or doesn't want to use the keyword DNS, so we'll simply put in the port 53. And then we'll click on Recheck. It says, okay, line 2's okay, but now line 6 has a problem. It doesn't like HTTPS. So we'll go ahead and change that to 443. And if it didn't like www for whatever reason, we could put port 80 there. So the way this is going to work is if a user matches a rule that says we're doing web authentication, we can download this access control list as an intermediate step while we're waiting for that user to authenticate. So here's what I'd recommend. If you're labbing this up and practicing with it and are not sure what protocols you may or may not need, but you still want to verify that the right downloadable ACL is being used, we could do something like this. We could do a permit IP any for a lab environment only. Click on recheck, and that will not be restrictive on that port. Now the cool thing is this, we can still verify that that downloadable access control list has been downloaded and is applied on behalf of that user on that port, and at the same time not worrying about our lab breaking because we forgot to permit a protocol. And then once we have the functionality all working, you can go back to these downloadable ACLs and start locking them down. So I'm going to go ahead and click on submit. So now we have this waiting for WebAuth downloadable ACL that we can use if we include it in an authorization profile. And let's create one more that we can use in a second authorization profile for individuals who have authenticated via WebAuth. And let's call this one AD users via WebAuth, indicating that it was a user who's in Active Directory who successfully authenticated, and now we're going to have a downloadable ACL associated with a profile for that user. And again here, you could go ahead and put in the access that you actually wanted to give for that user. And for our example, I'm just going to do a permit IP any again. Let's check our syntax real quick. Looks great. And we'll click on submit. So now we have a downloadable ACL that we can use to protect a port while we're waiting for the user to authenticate. And we have a second downloadable access control list that we can associate with an authorization profile for an Active Directory user who has successfully authenticated via WebAuth. Just like on a Cisco router or switch, these access control lists are pretty much wasting space until we apply them somewhere. So the next thing I'd like to do is let's create a couple of authorization profiles right here. So the location to modify our authorization profiles is policy, policy elements, results, and authorization profiles. And let's create our first one that's going to require somebody who, if we don't know who they are, that's going to require them to go ahead and authenticate via web authentication. And to create a new authorization profile, we'll simply click on Add. And let's name this authorization profile You Must WebAuth. In a learning environment, giving those profiles meaningful names is going to help us remember where they came from and what their purpose is. So our main purpose of creating this authorization profile is for this feature right here. We want to require web redirection. So if the user is trying to use port 80 or port 443, if we haven't authenticated them yet, we want to redirect their traffic as it's going into the switch, redirect it over to the ICE server to a portal where we can ask that user, hey, what's your username? What's your password? We need to know before we can let your traffic go free. So we'll check this box that says web redirection. And if we scroll down a little bit, we now have some options here, including centralized web authentication, which is what we're going to do. Now the access control list it's asking for right here is the ACL that we predefined on the switch. And that predefined access control list on the switch was called redirect. And there's several ways that we could verify that. So on the switch, let's do a show access list. And there's our access list called redirect. And it is matching on traffic that is destined to TCP port 80 or 443. So on the ICE server, we're going to take that word redirect, the name of our access control list that exists already on the switch. Let's move the console out of the way. And I'm going to paste that there. Next, it's asking, okay, how do you want to redirect this? Now, if we created a custom portal, we could say, I want to go ahead and redirect manually, and I want to redirect to the portal called Our Captive Portal. That's what we named it. And if we scroll up just a little bit, if we wanted to apply a downloadable ACL, we could, based on this authorization profile, which is also going to cause the redirection to happen. So I'm going to use that downloadable ACL that we created as an example called waiting for WebAuth. So if this authorization profile is used, a downloadable ACL called waiting for WebAuth is going to be applied to the port, and the web redirection of that user's traffic, if it's port 80 or port 443, is going to be redirected over to the custom portal called Our Captive Portal. And the details regarding what traffic is going to be redirected is based on the contents of that access control list, which exists on the switch. And if we scroll all the way to the bottom here, so we'll click on Submit to save that. And there it is, our authorization profile called You Must WebAuth. The second thing that you and I get to do is create a second authorization profile that we can apply for individuals who have already done web authentication and now they just want to go out to the internet. They don't want to have their traffic redirected, all of it, to the ICE server every single time they try to go to the internet. So we'll create a second authorization profile. We'll click on Add, and we'll call it AD Users Who WebAuthed. And if we wanted to apply a different downloadable ACL, we could go ahead and select it here. We have the AD Users via WebAuth. If we wanted to put users in a specific VLAN, we could. So let's go ahead and save this. And here's our two brand new authorization profiles. One that's going to require and do redirection for web authentication, and another authorization profile that's simply going to give full access to an individual who has done web authentication successfully. For our next step, we're going to go to Policy and then go to Authentication. Now, since we're already on Policy, we could just select the Authentication subtab here. So currently, for our authentication policy, we're using the defaults, which identify the protocols that ICE is going to try to use to communicate with network devices, as well as which identity stores are going to be used for authentication. So we have some conditions for MAB, Mac Authentication Bypass, some conditions for 802.1x, and then a default if those conditions aren't met. So what we're going to do is we're going to play a little teeny trick on Mac Authentication Bypass. Now to do that, we could go ahead and click on Edit for the MAB Authentication Policy rule, or we could go ahead and simply double click on it and that would open it up as well. Now by default, it's using internal endpoints for Mac Authentication Bypass, and that's a good thing. That's where we, in our previous video on Mac Authentication Bypass, we created an internal endpoint for the MAC address of the computer that was connected on port gig 0/7. So that's fine. And if we take a look at the details regarding the internal endpoints and click on this little target symbol, it's showing us what's going to happen if the authentication fails, or if the user is not found, or if the process fails. And by default, it's reject, reject, and drop. And what we want to do is we want to say, you know what, if you don't know who the user is, don't quite give up. Don't reject. Don't send a reject message. We want to use the advanced option of saying, please continue. And that'll give you and I an opportunity, if the user is unknown, to jump into web authentication. So to change that, we're going to click on this plus symbol next to internal endpoints. And in the advanced option where it says if user is not found, reject, we're going to change that and say, let's go ahead and simply continue. Once we're done, we can click over here on the right, click on done. And then we think we're done, but there's a teeny little really important box in the bottom left-hand corner called Save. And if you don't save it, those changes, the continue option, will not be part of the config. We absolutely want it to be if we want to enable the possibility of doing web authentication. So we'll click on Save. And in the bottom right-hand corner, it has an indicator saying that it was successfully saved. That's great. And the next thing we need to do is we need to apply our authorization rule that says we want to go ahead and do the redirection so that we can do centralized web authentication. And to do that, under policy, we're going to go down to authorization. So you could do policy authorization from this menu, or if you're already in policy, we can simply click on the tab for authorization. Here's our authorization rule that we created that says if the EAP fast chaining is successful and it's a valid user and the computer's a member of the domain, go ahead and let them in. And what we're going to do is we are going to add a rule right here that says if the user is unknown, let's go ahead and use the authorization policy that's going to call upon the redirection and force the web authentication. So to do that, we're going to take this default rule at the bottom, click on the arrow, and that's going to give us an option to insert a new rule above that default rule at the bottom. And let's call this rule must web auth, meaning you must authenticate via the web. And we could go ahead and put in the conditions and that authorization profile there. Now, this is a lot like cooking. There's more than one way of forcing this. For example, I'm going to click on reset. If we didn't want to create a new rule, we could simply modify the default rule if we wanted to. For example, we could go to the default, click on edit. Instead of just permitting access, we could call upon right here as our default rule the requirement for web authentication. To do that, we'd select the plus symbol next to permit access. We'd use the drop down, or in this case, a drop up and over. And then we're going to click on standard, meaning standard profiles, and check this out. We have our authorization profile called you must web auth. And we'll select that and click on done. Now, if none of the other authorization rules kick in, the default is going to be, hey, you need to be redirected over to the ICE server to perform web authentication. So whether we want to create a new rule before the default or modify that last default rule, both options work. So we'll click on save. So now let's take a look at what's going to happen. So we have Bob, or IT Bob, sitting at his computer. Let's say this computer does not have a supplicant, so 802.1x is going to fail. And let's also say that for MAC authentication bypass, we have not configured ICE with the MAC address on Bob's computer. So normally, MAC authentication bypass would fail, except we told ICE in the authentication rules, based on an unknown user, for MAC authentication bypass, it should continue. So here in our authorization policy, it's going to go down this list until there's a match. Now, in a situation where there's no 802.1x supplicant and the computer is unknown to ICE, it would go ahead and go through this entire list. It would hit the default rule at the very end, and then the authorization profile that we assigned for the default, that's going to trigger the download of the access control list we have associated with this profile, and it's going to trigger the centralized web authentication and the redirect to the ICE server for authentication. Now, once the user has authenticated, we need to apply a second authorization profile that says, oh, by the way, you no longer need to be redirected to the ICE server. Instead, you can just have full access, and here's your new downloadable ACL on your port that'll provide that access that you need. So, to apply a new authorization profile, we are going to create a brand new authorization policy rule. To do that, we're going to go to the default, click on Insert New Rule above, and let's call this new rule the AD user who web authed. And for the conditions, let's click on the plus symbol here, and we're going to create a new condition with the advanced option. And let's specify that for AD1, which is our external identity source, which is our Active Directory, that we're going to look for external groups. And regarding external groups, we're going to use the option of equals. We want to make sure that this user is a member of domain users. So this new authorization rule, as part of our authorization policy, says we're looking for someone who has authenticated and is a member of the domain users group. Now, we could leave it like that. However, there is the possibility, as we have more and more functions being used by ICE, that somebody coming down this list may have already authenticated, but maybe it wasn't through web authentication. Maybe they used .1x, but their computer wasn't authenticated. So that means they wouldn't have matched this rule. And then when they hit our AD users who web authed, if that user was a member of the Active Directory domain users group, this rule that we're creating is going to catch not only the people who did web auth, but also the people who authenticated with a .1x supplicant and had not matched the previous rule where their machine also was matched. So what we could do, we could make this more granular. And again, it's like a cooking show. We have lots of options that we can use. And one of our options to make it more granular is to use this gear on the right hand side. We'll click it and we'll say I want to add an additional attribute / value. Now we have our options here of and or. So we could say I want this user to be a member of Active Directory domain users group, and I also want to go ahead and specify that regarding network access and regarding use case, I want to go ahead and equal guest flow. And that guest flow is the association with the web auth that the user is doing, because it's also the portal that we would also be using for guest authentications into our network. So now with these two conditions in place, this rule is only going to be matched when a user is a member of Active Directory and they also use the web authentication mechanism for authenticating. So with those conditions in place, we can now go to the permissions column right here. And for the permissions, we can specify that we want to go ahead and choose from a standard profile and the one that we just created called AD users who web authed. And there's two really important things about that authorization profile. Number one, it is not going to trigger redirection again of their web traffic, so they can go out to the internet or other resources instead of having everything redirected over to ICE. And secondly, the downloadable ACLs or any of the other policies associated with that profile will be applied to that port where our user has successfully authenticated via WebAuth. So we'll click on Done, and then of course in the bottom left we'll click on Save. I've also noticed that sometimes there's a Submit button as opposed to Save, depending on the version and flavor of ICE that you're using and which screen you're on. And the key ingredient is making sure that you save the changes, whether it says Submit or Save, so that the configuration that we make can actually be reflected in the ICE server. So that is saved. Let's go ahead and go up to Operations and Authentications, and let's see what activity is currently happening. Now I've got a couple of bad authentications that have happened, and they are a little bit dated. Those happened more than an hour ago. And since then, I have the port shut down. And they're both on gig 0/8, where I have that computer. There's the new MAC address. It's a Windows 8.x client. And I also have had that port 0/8 shut down since we started the configuration. So if we bring back our console on the switch, and we go to interface gig 0/8, let's go ahead and do a no shutdown. And that will bring it up. Now, that is a very, very good sign. It said starting MAC authentication bypass for this client. That's the MAC address that we just looked at a few moments ago. And it said it was successful. Authentication results success from MAC authentication bypass. You'll notice also in the background that we have some updated information that indicates success as well. Let's do this. Let's do a show authentication session for interface gig 0/8. And let's go ahead and start at the top here. So there's our show command. There's the MAC address. There's the IP address that's currently in use by that computer. The username was sent over as its MAC address. That wasn't found as an endpoint for MAC authentication bypass, but because we said continue, it went through the authorization policies, didn't match any until the very end, the default one, and because we modified the default authorization rule, It said, we're going to use the profile called You Must Authenticate via the web, which did the redirection and it pushed down an ACL. So look at this. Here's the URL redirect ACL called redirect, which again is referring to the access control list that's already on this switch. Here's our URL redirection to ice.nuglab.com. And that's another reminder that having the ability to resolve names to IP addresses in many environments, including redirection, is going to be important. And there's also this access control list called waiting for WebAuth that has been pushed down and now is logically applied to this port until that user does the web authentication. Also right here on the operations and authentications page, and let's expand this column just a little bit. It shows us right here the downloaded access control list that it sent down to the switch. In the authorization profile, it indicated the authorization profile that was used, which was named You Must WebAuth. And the cool thing is this, we can also click on this link right here, Show Live Sessions. And if we click on Show Live Sessions, it's going to give us the details for that existing session, which is pretty darn cool. So if we click on Show Live Authentications again, it takes us back to that main page for operations and authentications. So our next step is to go ahead and send some web traffic from that computer on port gig 0/8 and have that redirection send us over to the ICE server so that we can authenticate as the user IT-Bob, who's a member of Active Directory and is also in the domain users group. So let's go over to Bob's computer. So here we're sitting at Bob's computer. Let's open up Internet Explorer. And now by default it was trying to go to google.com and my browser's complaining, hey, I've got a problem with the certificate for google.com. The reality is we are being redirected over to the ICE server, and this new computer on port gig 0/8 doesn't yet trust the certificate authority. It can't verify the signature of the certificate authority that's being used by the ICE server. So if we went somewhere else, for example, let's go to Novell. You'll notice even though we're trying to go to a completely different URL, it still says there's a problem with the website certificate. And that's because we're really going to the ICE server. The redirection is happening. So for our demonstration, let's say continue to this website by clicking on that link. And you'll notice we're now at ice.nuglab.com. So we'll log in as IT-Bob. And we'll put in our password. And we'll click on Sign On. And there's our acceptable use policy, which we said would be required the first time a user logs on. So we'll go ahead and click on We accept and click on accept, and now we have authenticated. So now let's do this. Now that we have successfully authenticated, if we go back to our ICE console and we refresh the screen, look at this. Now that we authenticated, it downloaded a brand new access control list called AD users via WebAuth. And over here on the right, check this out. The authorization profile that was used is the one that says AD users who have WebAuth. So if we go back to Bob's computer and we try opening up a new tab, for example, and we go to novell.com, it's going to take us right there. It doesn't bother doing the redirection again. And if we go back to the console, and we use the up arrow key to do a show authentication sessions for interface gig 0/8, you'll notice there's no longer a redirection URL being referred to. Here's our updated access control list based on the authorization profile we're matching. There's our username of IT-Bob. There's the IP address being used by Bob's computer. And there's Bob's MAC address. And he now has full access based on what's permitted by that access control list to network resources. In this video, we've taken a look at the configuration on both the switch as well as the ICE server to allow web authentication in the event we don't have an endpoint identified for MAB or an 802.1x supplicant running on the computer for the purposes of authentication. I have had a great time in this video. I would strongly encourage you in a practice environment to lab this up and get the hands-on practice of implementing web-based authentication. I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.